discussing with him a little bit about phenomenology and practice and deeper about his work on attention. And it's really great to have him in this series today. So Dan is a writer, researcher, and mindfulness teacher. I think he brings a really unique background to our speaker series today. So he has graduate degrees in economics, global studies, and philosophy. And then he has over 10 years experience working in the Bank of England, which I'm interested to hear. I don't know if this gives certain perspective maybe on talking about the attention economy. And there's a deep training in phenomenology as well, and as a mindfulness practitioner, which I think is really key when we're talking about critiquing and the attention economy and sort of trying to find our way forward. So Dan is now working as a freelancer, writer, researcher, working on the attention economy, phenomenology, and contemplative practice. And I was really drawn to his work because of the focus on phenomenology originally. But what struck me as unique about Dan's approach is also his emphasis on practice. And as I mentioned before, I think that this is key when we're talking about the attention economy. We can work many of us here are philosophers, but we can work in theories and that's useful in some regard. But I'm always constantly questioning, like, okay, well, how is this changing my walking down the street or sitting eating with my daughter in the morning when I'm feeling a bit rushed about like all the things that need to get done? How is this philosophy something that I can experiment with and move around in the world? And the attention economy is certainly with our phones and our devices and our computers, which you might be checking your email on the side right now, something like this. So it affects all of us here in this room. So without further ado, I present and introduce Dan Nixon on his talk, Just Perceive, How Phenomenology and the Arts Can Guide Us in the Tech Era. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Hunter and Madeline, so much for the comprehensive introduction, far more comprehensive than I could have done myself, so appreciate that. So good to see everyone here, and please feel free to have your webcams on if you're comfortable and happy to do so, but of course, totally up to you with that one. So let me just share my screen here. And again, grateful I don't need to do much of an introduction to myself here, but this is kind of the framing I thought for our session today that I would talk about. And background, as Madeline said, I have interdisciplinary background, albeit not in academia, but kind of graduate degrees up to master's level in a few disciplines. And during my career at the Bank of England, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, Madeline, because it is true that certainly the economy was something for a long time, was something I was working with day to day for several years. And quite separately to the economy, is attention in the form of mindfulness and Buddhist practices that I developed over many years as well. So I had attention and I had economics as interests, and it kind of made sense around 2012 onwards to be interested in how these came together. And when I was at the central bank here in the UK, I wrote a blog post about the crisis of attention, in particular, how it links to maybe the economy more widely. And this got a lot of media pickup in the FT and the Economist, in the Times, the BBC, and so on. And since leaving that career over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, I've written several pieces broadly around the attention economy, around embodiment, around mindfulness. So there's an Eon essay on Merleau-Ponty and an embodiment, kind of framed in the digital context of our day-to-day lives, and again with a focus on practice as well. And another piece here around bringing a spirit of questioning to our relationship with tech, which you can look at later if you're interested. So I wanted to kind of just introduce this basic framing when it comes to our relationship with tech, how we discuss the public conversation, if you like, around our relationship with tech and our own relationship with our devices. Coming back to what are we looking at? Coming back to what are we perceiving as kind of our entry point? So I'm going to introduce that and look at kind of this idea of just perceive as a basic or as a starting response to the whole set of issues around the attention economy. And then going to try and go briskly through this, and then so I can kind of unpack this with a few examples, drawing on phenomenology, drawing on the visual arts. So 3 kind of applications of how I think this is insightful. So what are we looking at? If we begin, I mean, I'll just share a quick anecdote. A while ago, I was waiting for a train in London on the platform, on the underground, and the train arrived. As usual, I was kind of just staring into space, and the doors opened, and a pigeon walked off the train and kind of looked at me and carried on walking past me, past the platform. This isn't my photo. This is one I found online. I didn't capture it at the time. But there was a funny moment. And then when I got on the train, I guess I was hoping or expecting maybe to share that moment with someone else that was on the train who maybe had the same experience of the pigeon just walking off the train, as if it did that every day on its daily commute. But everyone around me was glued to their screen, was staring at their phones. And of course, this is quite common, isn't it? That everyone kind of looking at their screen. But even so, in that moment, it just made me really think, what are we all looking at on our screens all of the time? What are we seeing through tech? What are we not seeing, whether it's pigeons or moments of eye contact with each other and so on. So just, it raised this question, the central question. Of course, we can look into our relationship with the digital media ecosystem through the lens of attention, through the lens of agency, or of course, information or power dynamics. But what about seeing or perception? So specifically, just this question, what are we all looking at in the digital age, both with tech and also without tech? This felt just something worth exploring. And so again, how are we perceiving each other and the wider world? And of course, what are we not seeing in the kind of smartphone era of the past 15 years or so, 10, 12 years or so? So why might we wish to put these questions at the heart of our inquiry? And maybe I'll just say here, I'm thinking again with my background and the work I do about the public debates around technology, perhaps more than academic, lines of inquiry. But of course, this may well, I'll be interested to hear your views on whether this line of inquiry that we'll be looking at today is pertinent in academic context. But I'm thinking more kind of in the public discourse and our own relationship with tech. But let's just see where we get to with that. So why might we put this question of seeing at the center of things? And the first reason, the obvious one, is of course tech shapes what we see in really fundamental ways. So how we find out about what's going on through the news, through social media, and of course with that we get a very limited view on what's going on. Echo chambers, and depending on who we follow or which platform we're using, we're going to see very different things from someone else. We know about this. And of course, how we see each other. And Sherry Turkle talks about how we consume one another in bits and pieces through, updates and posts on our phones, through kind of messages, more than actually seeing the whole person in the flesh, in conversations. So that shift to consuming one another in bits and pieces, this kind of really resonated for me when I read that from Sherry Turkle's work. So tech shapes what we see, we know that. But I think the other reason is tech also has a particular narrative for what it means to see in the first place. And by tech, I really mean Silicon Valley and the dominant worldview or mindset of entrepreneurs working in the tech sector. So I would, assert that the implicit assumption is really that you perceive objects in your environment more or less in the same way that a computer operates. That's the working assumption. So when you perceive a red rose and the color and the vivid color and texture and the scent and the smell of the rose, well, we can break this down into you're getting data from the rose, from your external environment in through your sense organs. And then that data is processed through your kind of CPU, which is, of course, which is the brain. So in other words, it's a data processing account of perception that's assumed when you would kind of think about perception from a Silicon Valley perspective. And of course, on this view, if perception is really about data, getting data in and then processing that data and doing things with it, then of course our tech interfaces allow us to see more, perceive more, because we get more data in, we can do more with that data if we wish to. So the implication of this data processing narrative of what perception is, well, there's a corollary really that actually if what we're perceiving can be reduced down to data and processing that data, then of course the corollary is actually then equally a technological system will be able to see everything or it can see in the same way that we see, if it all amounts to ultimately data processing. Now, I don't think that is true, but this is, I think, the rhetoric which is infused into the marketing and the rhetoric, as I said, of a lot of tech companies. So for instance, Android markets a camera, a smart camera that it says can see you the way you see you. So it's really about seeing in the same way as we can. Of course, the Oculus headset denotes the eye and vision and seeing other worlds. And really this slide here from Mark Zuckerberg talking about the metaverse and the possibilities there. And I'll just read this one. When we have smart glasses on our faces, this will be the first time that an AI system will be able to really see the world from our perspective, see what we see, hear what we hear, and more. And I think that idea, which kind of doesn't go challenge because, people are fixated on issues of privacy or issues of kind of power, issues of monetization, et cetera, and so this kind of statement that, yeah, this AI system can really see what we see, hear what we hear. It's just taken as like, this is the advance of the technology. But I think actually this needs unpacking and interrogating. Certainly, I think this basis around perception as the future of a lot of these emergent technologies is something that we should really work with and interrogate. So again, what are we looking at? What does it mean to see the world around us in the first place, let alone what would it mean for an AI system to see what we see, as Zuckerberg claims? And so, coming back to our inquiry then, what happens if we place seeing at the heart of our investigation vis-a-vis tech to our everyday experiences? And to do this not in a detached way, kind of in an empiricist fashion, that would be one way to look at this, but in a way which honors and stays curious towards what it's actually like to perceive the world around us. That's my interest here. So just to sum up where we're going with this then, so this question of what are we looking at, we can take as our starting point in two ways. First of all, as investigators, so in terms of our methodology for trying to make sense of what's going on in the digital media ecosystem, but also, and perhaps more so, as tech users, when we think about our own relationship with tech, how we're using tech and how it's shaping our lives, maybe coming back to this question, what am I looking at? What are we all looking at? How are we perceiving each other? I think maybe is a really good kind of foundational question if we want to pursue a richer and fuller life with tech and of course, and without tech as well, rather than, for instance, a lot of the narrative around exploring our relationship with tech can be around well-being, what makes us happier or not, or maybe kind of smart, what they call, smart habits around tech, which is fine. But I think that whole idea of life hacks and smart ways of using tech obviously is totally internalizing a particular worldview of Silicon Valley itself. And actually, I think this question, what are we looking at? What are we perceiving? How are we perceiving? Actually allows us a richer entry point into the whole discussion. So let's unpack this idea then a little bit more of like just perceive or perception as our basic response then to the attention economy. And phenomenology for me really stands out as the school of philosophy which can really be fruitful for us in this endeavor. So phenomenology then, I'm kind of characterizing is coming back again and again to what our everyday lived experience is actually like, and being curious about that and coming back to that again. And so bracketing out maybe some of our beliefs or assumptions or theories around how things seem to be or might be, we can still go into those as well, but we can bracket them out and come back actually to what our actual lived experience is like as it unfolds. So it's really a focus on making the effort and having the respect to really describe the world as we experience it before rushing to explain the world through some theory or some particular analytical framework as a philosopher or as a natural scientist and so on. And so Merleau-Ponty, who I'll be focusing on today, talks about philosophy needs to undergo a radical turning back. It needs to rediscover a more primordial contact with the world. And so phenomenology certainly doesn't need to be centered all around perception, but it quite often can be. Certainly Merleau-Ponty, his work often does center around perception. So just a couple of linkages from phenomenology to how we perceive the world. I mean, Husserl talked about a new way of looking at things as being necessary. He talked about how we need to see what stands before our eyes, to distinguish, to describe. That's the basic kind of injunction and need and demand for phenomenology. Merleau-Ponty talks about true philosophy consists in relearning to look at the world. I also love this this statement here. It's at the same time true that the world is what we see, but nonetheless, we must learn to see it. So not just assuming that seeing is something we kind of understand, and then we need to go on to the more difficult things. Actually, seeing itself is something we can practice, something we can learn to get better at. Something which I think probably all visual artists will appreciate, something which maybe coders in Silicon Valley may be a little bit less, could be a little bit more dismissive of potentially. So this idea that we learn to see, I think is very central to what I'm proposing here. And I'll just pause here, and with this framing around perception, and of course, one reason why I like this compared with attention, as in the attention economy and how our attention, we're using our attention or who's grabbing our attention. And that is an absolutely, I mean, that is the obvious and probably the best framing I can think of. So I'm not against the attention economy framing, but with discussions around attention, you will often see attention talked about as kind of an inner resource. It's a resource that we have, in our brains, a certain amount of attention, and we can choose to pay attention to this. If we don't choose to pay attention, then, something's going to grab our attention. So what's going on there? And the thing about perception, by contrast, is it links the seer and the seen directly, always. So there's always that kind of interrelationship between subject and object, between me and what I'm seeing, in other words, the world. So the thrust of phenomenology from Husserl with, to the things in themselves, that kind of, we need to, not make this something around just our inner worlds, inner experiences, but we are always in this back and forth with the world. Certainly this back and forth, which I'll talk about, is something which I think really motivated Merleau-Ponty. And I find that a really helpful kind of context for discussion of this issue compared with discussions which kind of treat us as isolated atoms, which have attention to give to things, which may just underappreciate, if you like, the interconnectedness, the interrelationality of us vis-a-vis the world. So just this last quote, and I've just shared a couple of images from the Japanese photographer Nobuyuki Kobayashi here, because I thought they're really, really nice images. But Merleau-Ponty again, with the first vision, there is initiation, the opening of a dimension that can never again be closed. A little bit enigmatic, but I think this is a kind of a nice motivation here. So just to summarize then, I'm kind of working here with what I'm calling a philosophy of just perceiving. And before I read this out, when I say I'm talking about a philosophy in terms of for the everyday person, what their life philosophy might be. So rather than in a kind of strictly academic sense. So I could embrace what I would call an everyday life philosophy of just perceiving the world as my starting point. And what I mean by that is, and I'll read this out, remaining interested in all that you can see and hear and touch as the eternal starting point for exploring the world around you, both with and without tech. And of course, with that, also noticing all of the thoughts, all of the theories, all of the frameworks that arise along the way. And we can use these, we can engage with these, and we can have much better inquiries, of course, by doing so. But not letting these become divorced from, entirely divorced from our primordial moment-to-moment immersion in the world, which is the perceptual world as we experience it. Merleau-Ponty talked about kind of adopting the mindset of the perpetual beginner. I think actually he got this from Husserl as well, which I love. And this links with ideas in Zen Buddhism, for instance, of beginner's mind. This idea of coming back again and again to our actual lived experience, being really receptive to what's there. And the link with phenomenology, in especially this perception and seeing centrality there with the visual arts is kind of an obvious one, but one quote here, that poets and painters are born phenomenologists because they pay attention to the way that things speak to us. And another quote here, which I'm just going to skip over because of time. So let's explore then, okay, how could this framing, what are we looking at, and phenomenology based around perception and the visual arts as inspiration, how could this be insightful for us? And again, as investigators into the attention economy, but more than that, perhaps as individual tech users, as we explore our own relationship with tech. So I think the first insight, and I've kind of touched on this already, is this idea of seeing the whole, seeing the whole rather than just the parts, seeing itself as being holistic rather than a purely analytical or mechanistic endeavor. So again, I mentioned with tech, we can easily, and I think we're invited to see the world in data chunks, in bits and pieces. On Twitter, a whole stream of opinions about what's happening. On Instagram and Facebook and TikTok, a whole stream of images to engross and engage us. But it's a very particular way, isn't it, of engaging with the world. And so Merleau-Ponty, among many others, really emphasizes the Gestalt and the kind of holistic nature of actually what it means to see something. So he says, in perception, we witness the miracle of a totality that surpasses what one thinks to be its conditions or parts. And he talks a lot about how painters naturally embrace and have to embrace, again, this kind of seeing the whole and not kind of just dealing with the bits and pieces in an analytical way. So he says that in working over a favorite problem, even if it's just the problem of velvet or wool, the true painter unknowingly upsets the givens of all the other problems. His quest is total, even when it looks partial. So even when you're just working as a painter on trying to change the texture of velvet that you're working on, that will affect everything. And the same applies for anything else you may work on. That inherent kind of the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts nature of painting, of looking at works of art, and of course Merleau-Ponty would say, but also perception in general. The painting here is actually obviously not velvet or wool, but it was referenced in the nearby passage to where I took that quote from. So what I'll do for each of these three applications is just highlight quite briefly one visual artist who I think kind of brings to life some of the ideas we're talking about here. So Dorothea Lange, the American photographer, working through the Depression era in America and through the 40s, 50s, and 60s as well of the last century. Again, she embraces this very holistic understanding of what it is to see. So she says, seeing is more than a physiological phenomenon. We see not only with our eyes, but with all that we are, and all that our culture is. And I totally agree with that. And that just resonates with me. And I just couldn't help myself juxtaposing that statement with, again, Mark Zuckerberg's one from earlier, that, we're at a stage where an AI system can really see the world from our perspective, that it can see what we see. And of course, looking at Lang's quote here, if we see with all that we are and all that our culture is, then it makes it impossible, I think, for a statement to be true that an AI system could see what we see. And of course, I'm sure Zuckerberg would concede this point as well. I'm not, but it's more about what's being suggested with the rhetoric he's giving us. What ideas around what it means to perceive the world are we invited to take up? And I think, Dorothea Lang gives us a much better inspiration here than Zuckerberg does. And just in the metaverse, again, Zuckerberg says, you're going to feel like you're really there with other people. You'll see their facial expressions. You'll see their body language. Again, this is a stretch. I mean, is that true? Of course, what you'll actually see is an AI kind of rendering of what your friends' facial expressions might look like. Based, yes, in part by some data inputs from what their facial muscles are actually doing, but also based on a lot of programming to render an image that moves in a realistic way. So, for instance, there's kind of add-ins that developers will use to kind of standardize facial movements so that it looks like a normal wave rather than what you actually happen. Maybe you're actually doing this, but they think that's going to look funny. So let's just make sure it looks like normal, because I think they're trying to wave as an example. So, what is it that we're actually seeing in the metaverse? And I think we don't need to go into this, but that's just, again, where the rhetoric around what we will be seeing, what we will be perceiving, I think is very different from the reality. So summarizing this kind of insight then, tech invites us to view and engage the world in bits and pieces as a very analytical, quite mechanistic view of perception, whereas actual human perception is much richer and it's more holistic, and artists and artworks really make this clear. And so we should push back against these very reductionist accounts of what it is to see the world, what it is to touch or to perceive the world around us. And as a practice for this, in terms of holistic perception, I mean, something you can try if you haven't come across this one, the 5 breaths meditation. So find a quiet moment, close your eyes, and just take a deep breath and spend a deep breath on what you can feel in your body. And then go through the other senses. So deep breath on what you can feel, deep breath on what you can smell, what you can taste, what you can hear, and then open your eyes, and the 5th breath, just what can you see for that breath. So we won't do that now together, but this is something maybe you can try out later, especially in nature. It's a great one to try out. And that's kind of coming to the senses, attuning to the whole, to the gestalt of your perceptual experience. So the second insight is really about seeing for its own sake. So again, the kind of title of today's session, Just Perceive. It doesn't mean we don't do anything other than perceive, but it is enough to just perceive. There's more than enough wonder and more than enough kind of interest that we can bring to the simple act, but the mysterious act of perception. And this rubs up against, I think, the tech mindset and the tech kind of, I guess, like incentivization to always be doing things instrumentally. And we'll kind of unpack this here. So Merleau-Ponty says, philosophy does not seek a verbal substitute for what we see. So he's very skeptical of any attempt to kind of say, oh yeah, you see this, okay, so we can kind of understand that through philosophy, through what we're writing. What you see is always just what you see. Actual perception alone can teach us what perception is. It sounds maybe tautological, but it's easily, I think, glossed over when we go into theories and frameworks around how we make sense of the world, whether it's philosophy or anthropology or other disciplines. So Merleau-Ponty just really asks us to have some caution when we do this. And he says, for instance, a shadow passing or the creaking of branches have each a meaning. Just the simple isness or thisness, the ineffable essence of what we see, what we hear, presents itself. It has a kind of expressiveness with what we're presented with. And I was just thinking of Wittgenstein here as well. The work of art does not aim to convey something else, just itself. Again, we may be tempted to see a work of art and talk about what it means. And that's fine. And maybe there is a discussion to be had about that. But certainly that discussion isn't the main thing. And actually, as he says, it is just what it is. That may be unhelpful for a lot of kind of lines of inquiry in terms of so what or what next. But actually, I think it's something really helpful to come back to. Again, in the spirit of this, just Dorothea Lange again, the contemplation of things as they are, without error or confusion, is in itself a nobler thing than a whole harvest of invention. Thinking about kind of putting on smart glasses and seeing the world with all kinds of ways of engaging with the world, with new opportunities and so on. That may be entertaining, that may be engaging, that may be educational. But, you know, Lange's reminding us that actually just this pure contemplation of things as they are, can we be interested in this and actually rest with and have patience for that practice of slow seeing? So again, with tech, unsurprisingly, we have this instrumentalization of things that we see, as we have instrumentalization, I think, of everything. So the general point here is, you know, what Evgeny Morozov calls tech solutionism. If you're not familiar, then this is the idea that our devices and our apps lead us to see everything that we do in our lives as a series of problems to be solved. If you want to go running, okay, there's an app, and then we can make sure that like you kind of stick to the regime and you can check your progress, you can measure how you're doing, and you can set goals, and you can try and kind of improve and so on. And that's not a bad thing, but there's a mindset of problem solving and optimization really baked into how we're invited to use our tech devices, because otherwise we wouldn't keep using them again and again. And so this idea of tech solutionism, when it comes to what we see, is just the idea that we're, of course, with social media, for instance, you know, with selfies and so on, we're solicited to capture the moment and, of course, share it with our friends and, of course, tweak that. So editing, optimizing the image, maybe making it more shareable by others, as we see, again, every day on social media. So what's going on with what we're actually seeing, and then how that's shared and how we're then led to see it on our devices. And of course, all of this is set within the digital media ecosystem, which platforms seek to maximize the number of eyeballs on screens. So again, that again is the kind of basic economic kind of incentive baked into the media ecosystem is one of eyeballs on screens. It's about seeing in a particular way. And just quickly, I thought I'd say, I mean, just think about the metaverse again, and one of the examples Mark Zuckerberg gives of augmented realities. If you have a pair of smart glasses, and he says, imagine you're in a meeting with colleagues, and then you get a text from your wife, and you see that in your kind of smart glass alert, and you want to reply, but you kind of don't want to be rude, you don't want to pull out your phone. So here's the great thing, he says, you can actually see the message and then compose a reply using your mind basically to do so, and then send that off. Your wife will get the reply very quickly, and your colleagues will, you know, they won't even know, they won't have even suspected a thing. And I find that a really curious example, if that's the best he can think of for the use case for this, because elsewhere he talks again and again about the metaverse being about really putting us in presence with one another, being present with one another. And of course, if I'm in a meeting with the people on the screen that I can see here, or with you guys, even if I'm kind of ostensibly looking at what's going on, if I'm actually thinking about something else and composing a text, albeit not looking at my phone, it's actually probably much more polite to say, really sorry guys, this is something urgent, I just need to quickly send something, rather than trying to do it in a clandestine fashion. So anyway, again, when it comes to the instrumentalization of seeing, this idea that we could be seeing each other, but actually seeing other things with and through tech is definitely something to interrogate, I think. And the artist here, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll try and just go a little swifter. But the British Liberian artist, Lena Irish Victor, I think is kind of really inspiring as a pushback to tech solutionism. So she focuses her practice around creating a setting in which the viewer can slow down and feel welcome to spend time with her work. And she's spoken against the drive in the art world for exposure for exposure's sake, or for having the most eyeballs see her work. And I think we can all relate, maybe in whatever field we're in, academic or journalistic or other things that we may do. We produce content perhaps for our work, and we want people to see that. And that's of course natural, but also this kind of having the most people see everything we produce is a very particular mindset. And she's pushing back against that and saying, I really want to focus on the inputs, really want to focus on what I'm doing and how someone could experience it. And then if it's successful, that's great, but I'm not going to be focused on optimizing the outcomes as my basic approach. And again, I think this speaks to the ethos that has to inform how so many artists, probably most or all artists, work. And it's a very, it's a very antithetical mindset, I think, to the kind of maximize eyeballs on screen, maximize engagement of your content that tech kind of leads us towards. So quickly to summarize this one, big tech encourages us to do a lot of looking and scrolling and so on. But actually an actual act of perception cannot be made into something else. And it is essentially ineffable, mysterious at some level. And a practice here is you can go to an art gallery and just spend 30 minutes, pick a work of art, choose carefully, and spend 30 minutes just observing. That will obviously feel like a long time unless you've done this before, and even if you have, just observing, staying with what you can see with this piece of art, and of course noticing the questions and thoughts and observations that arise as you do so, as a kind of counter to seeing things and capturing them and sharing them and all the rest of it. So last insight is seeing as a two-way dialogue rather than seeing as a very kind of unilateral phenomenon. So Merleau-Ponty writes about our basic encounter with the world. I'll just kind of skip through this, but basically leads us to see this crisscrossing of lateral overlapping perceptions between us and other people. We're caught in this world of overlapping perceptions with others. This is our basic kind of understanding, he would say, of what our lived world is like. And so it puts us in contact with other people, with other creatures, with other things through perception. And so he talks about the shared interworld where our gazes cross and our perceptions overlap. So eye contact and being in a shared space. And it's in these settings where the intertwining of your life and other people's life is revealed for us, which I think seems fairly obvious, but I just think it's kind of interesting to start with this crisscrossing, overlapping perception between perceiving beings, both human and non-human, as our starting point for making sense of the world around us and our experience and embeddedness in that world. And so rather than the unilateral act, I see you, we can think about perceptions as involving a back and forth between seer and seen, and hearer and heard, sorry, and so on. So things like dancing, things like holding hands, of course, a moment of eye contact, are just kind of easy examples of this. But more generally, Merleau-Ponty would say, and we don't have time to maybe explore this fully, but perceiver and perceived are together drawn up into the cohesion of life, is the idea. There's this kind of inherent two-way back and forth nature of perception itself. And artists, again, I think readily embrace this idea, much more so, I'm sure, than coders in Silicon Valley do, and understandably so. But still, it's just an interesting perspective. So Tracy Emin, British artist, one of many who've talked about kind of the dissolving of subject and object when you're kind of contemplating things as an artist. And so she won the Turner Prize in the UK in 1998 for her installation, My Bed. And when she was asked, how did you come up with the idea for My Bed? She responded, I didn't come up with an idea, the bed came up with me. So this kind of reversal of subject-object. And Merleau-Ponty cites, among others, Cézanne, his comment that the landscape thinks itself in me. So we have this kind of two-way back and forth and switching of subject and object in a more fluid way than maybe every day we may think about perception typically. So where does tech fit into this? I mean, I'd say that it can go either way for sure, and it can help maybe this dynamic relationship, but certainly it can also hinder it. So tech can desiccate the kind of fluid moving back and forth between seer and seen, or perceiver and perceived. So just thinking about at a concert, you know, rather than looking at the band on stage and them seeing you, I mean, everyone's looking at their screen or someone else's screen. And, you know, there's various musicians who've talked about what the experience is like for them to see everyone staring at their phones. I mean, and how that intersects, you know, the actual direct relationship they would otherwise have. Zoom as well. This is me and my sister. She doesn't know that she's in today's presentation, but here we're looking at each other. But of course, we don't have direct eye contact. And I'm looking at Madeline now as well, because her video is on. We may be kind of looking at each other's eyes, but of course, it's not direct eye contact, because to do that, I'd have to look at the camera. And if I'm looking at the camera, I'm not actually looking at Madeline, and vice versa. So we don't have that directness. Of course, I love Zoom. It's absolutely amazing. But just thinking about the subtleties of things like eye contact in-person interactions. And again, this doesn't need to be just vis-a-vis other humans. So I think about where I live, lots of cats, and kind of I get caught in kind of there's maybe cats staring at each other, and then I walk along and kind of I'm staring as well, looking, and we're caught in this, you know, overlapping lateral perceptions that Merleau-Ponty talks about. And just thinking about that experience compared with the one on the right hand side of the screen here. So there's a computer game called Stray. It's about a stray cat, and inevitably last summer after it was released, the people playing the game would like take photos of their own cat that was kind of looking at the cat on the screen and share that on Twitter. And so I'll find myself looking at Twitter, looking at a cat, looking at an animated cat on a screen, kind of in a whole stream of these, and just thinking about what's going on with that kind of looking versus the one on the left-hand side where I'm actually, you know, there in direct contact. And again, this is not kind of, this is an obvious point, but still one I think worth exploring and thinking about. Again, when it comes back to the question, what are we looking at? How are we perceiving each other and the world around us? So I'll just breeze through the summary here and the conclusion there. We should be vigilant of tech products and practices which desiccate the living and ambiguous space between seer and seen, or which eradicate the dynamic nature of that relationship between the two. I won't talk about the practice here, but just because I think Suraj on the previous session here was talking about mindfulness, and we may think about meditation and mindfulness often as being individual practices, but if you're interested, you could look up, if you're not familiar, Insight Dialogue. So Gregory Kramer is someone who's kind of done a lot of work on this, which is a simple meditation practice involving other people and spending time with your own experience, with your eyes closed together, but also opening your eyes then and observing the other person, holding them and each other in the space in silence, and then opening up into actually having a dialogue. So that doesn't do it justice, but just thinking about the kind of eye contact nature of the practice involved in that one. So again, sorry for, thank you, Madeline, for you're so kind not to have interrupted me. I know I'm a little bit over. So my summary slide, first of all, just to say, again, as kind of summary for this, Dorothea Lange said, the camera is an instrument that teaches people how to see without a camera. I think that's, you know, very incisive. Similarly, can we work with, can we demand that our digital technologies can be instruments which teach us to see both with them, but also without them, rather than using them to substitute the act of seeing? Can we really kind of demand that we can see better without them from having used them, rather than maybe see less well through the use of them? So what am I looking at as a question to come back to as investigators, but really especially as tech users, compared to just always coming through the lens of attention, certainly compared to coming through the lens of well-being, phenomenology and artists, but also just our everyday experience of perception point to a richer account of what it is to see than this kind of data processing, quite reductionist worldview, which I would say is baked into how our tech products are inviting us to engage with them. So to pursue a richer life, in the tech era, we can stay curious to our experience of perception and how this is mysterious, ineffable, and two-way in its nature. So I'll, I think, wrap up there and welcome discussion and questions around this.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. This was a really rich discussion. I have some things I want to ask you written down on the side. I'll start us off with a question so people can sort of gather their thoughts, and then I'll do, let's do I'll call out, you just raise your hand on the, not your real hand, your digital hand, your Zoom hand. And if Dan, maybe if you can close the
Yes.
slides, probably, I think that's best. And if anyone's able to put their cameras on, that makes the screen a little bit more friendly. So I have some questions about the senses and maybe the prioritization of seeing, and is seeing encompassing all the senses. But I wrote something down you said, and it was sort of so small in there, and I wanted to dive in a little bit. You said, when you were talking about phenomenology and how it describes instead of explains, you said we should be making the effort and having the respect to describe rather than explain the world. And I thought, ooh, what's that? So I was interested in and I have an intuition that maybe that's something to do with the relationality that you described in the third insight. The respect to meet and to be open to the world around us, and to even just notice. There's something respectful about noticing our relationality. And now I'm leading the question a little bit, but that was my thought on it. But I was wondering if you could, I don't know, speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, it's a nice question. Thank you. And I'll just say as well, before I answer, I'd be really happy if we can use this as a discussion amongst everyone, and rather than Q&A for me, because I don't know, I'm not an expert on any of this, and it would be great for me to hear kind of discussion amongst everyone else as well. But just to put that out there, it's funny, don't know if I quite talked about it in the words I use, and I just kind of ad-lib did that earlier about respect. And I think for me, it links with the sense of humility that I see as inherent in Merleau-Ponty's approach. So he's very big on questioning, and questioning in a way where you don't necessarily get the answer. The question helps you explore further, but the point is not to be able to pin something down, say this is how things are, and so now we can go further forward and kind of have greater knowledge and kind of advance in that way. But actually his questioning approach, a curiosity, brings us back again. This is why he talks about the perpetual beginner. He would consider himself, as would I, and this is why it's good to have this also here in the kind of, with some of the Buddhist connections for this group, coming back again and again with that humility of not knowing, but being open and curious to what's there. And so I think it's that humility, not knowing what we will find, or not being able to say, okay, yeah, I've seen this, and this is actually this as well, and I can build on that. So maybe even more, it's certainly with that respect for coming back to what we perceive around us. It's certainly respect in terms of the fact that, hey, this is not just I see the world and I'm the agent and the world's just the object for me. So you're absolutely right that there's kind of a respect for the two-way nature from the beginning and always. But it's also, I think, in the second of my insights around kind of the ineffable nature, the fact that what we see is just what we see. And that may be frustrating as a scientist or as a philosopher when we want to kind of work with that and say more about it. And we can try to do that. But at the end of the day, as Merleau-Ponty said, actual perception alone can teach us what perception is. Philosophy can't substitute for that. And I think it's maybe that where we need to respect our perceptual experience in knowing that, yes, we're going to develop theories and frameworks as well, but if they become divorced from our contact with the perceptual world, then there's a real problem there. There's a real disconnect.
I think also, I'm just thinking of this idea of which you're linking to as well as of like tech solutionism and treating the world as instrumental, and constantly I've been thinking a lot lately about like extractive thinking, where you're just going around the world and just trying to take the information that you can then reuse in some other way.
Yeah.
And there's some sort of like my intuition says there's something disrespectful about that as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, let's Core can go.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, thank you, Dan, for your nice presentation. I have a question. It's a little bit, of course, in the line of the foregoing question, but there's a kind of tension in the just perceiving approach between, on the one hand, you have to hold back or bracketing all your beliefs and ideas, and on the other hand, you see or you perceive with everything, with all your thoughts and with your whole culture. You cannot. You perhaps cannot even bracket that in a sense, and I guess that the answer to that tension is the dialogue that then unfolds. So much comes to what this dialogue actually can be, should be, and I wonder if perhaps Merleau-Ponty has a kind of methodology, or perhaps that's a heavy word, a kind of guidance for how to do such a dialogue well or less well, or is there anything you can say about that?
Great question. Oh, such a good question. I don't know if there's much I can say. The tension, you're absolutely right, and that's why, I mean, it's a little bit risky for me to come in with like just perceive, because it's just too simplistic, and it's certainly not a fair characterization of Merleau-Ponty's kind of philosophy or kind of orientation, and probably not mine either. But it is maybe, certainly there's the relative point that relative to other philosophers, and I would say other phenomenologists of the kind of major thinkers in the 20th century of phenomenology, I feel like Merleau-Ponty went further than others to really, again, respect kind of the embedded perceptual nature that, so I think what's a good quote, he says, all of my knowledge, even my scientific knowledge, is based upon, I'm paraphrasing now, but like based upon my actual everyday experience of the world. So it's just that caution against, we so easily divorce what we're talking about and the theories and the kind of the discourse from the experience itself. And that's a very natural thing to do, and he's kind of guarding against that. So certainly if we think about embodiment, which I haven't spoken about today, but anyone who's kind of read around Merleau-Ponty will know that he's most famous for his work on the body. And it's a good example of like, actually, we are embodied. We have, these bodies that are breathing and that we can sense. And, he says that, for instance, I would never look for my right arm. If you have a right arm, obviously, that you can sense, you'd never look for your right arm in the same way that you look for your phone or something around your desk. So the idea that like we are from the beginning and always embodied. it's so obvious, but it's interesting that that was so neglected in the history of philosophy, and you could say even within phenomenology, which is supposed to be about our coming back to our everyday experience. So that's just more an example of how he comes back to what we perceive and what we experience. On managing that tension, I don't have a good answer, even though I've read about it, but it's been so long since I've been in that literature to be coherent, or certainly to say something that people here wouldn't already know. So maybe someone else wants to come in on that point there.
Mm-hmm.
I had something just to add in there, because that was my other question. Like, I was knew a little bit about the talk beforehand. I was walking in this morning and thinking like, oh, can you just perceive? Are we so culturally embedded that it shapes our perception? I say yes, but then maybe I think the senses, and you point to that into the talk as well, is that maybe there is a practice you can do that's time framed. It's not something you do when you going around your full day, but there's these practices to tap into the senses that might be something close to just perceiving. I don't know if anyone has a response to that, or Dan. But.
I mean, I certainly respond to that, which is in the sense that there are many practices we can do which are coming back to the senses, and yoga or mindfulness meditation. A lot of mindfulness meditation is just noticing what's going on in the body. A lot of mindfulness meditations will be based around this. And what's quite interesting is I think certainly in the secular mindfulness world, and to some extent in Buddhist, it depends, but in some Buddhist traditions as well. I think Soraj last time talked about bare attention, the idea that you just observe what's there, just notice what's there in your experience. And certainly mindfulness practices would invite us to say, just notice the sensations of the breath in the body, or the sensations of your backside against the chair that you're sitting on, and just be with those. And that is the invitation, that is the practice. And of course, also thoughts around, okay, but I'm also thinking about that I'm not doing that. And that is wrapped into the practice. Okay, you become aware of those thoughts as well, and that's fine, but then you let go of those thoughts, come back again and again to the breath, or come back again and again to the sensations in your backside. And I think Merleau-Ponty would say that's an interesting thing to do, and probably quite a worthwhile thing to do, perhaps in terms of cultivating our ability to just attend, to just perceive what's there in our moment-to-moment experience. But I think he would also say, it's a somewhat artificial practice, in the sense that when we're actually walking in the park, we're perceiving trees with all of the kind of cultural associations or personal associations we may have with a big oak tree in a park, and what that represents for us. Or when we see, like the dentist, what the dentist means for us is obviously significant. So, back to kind of Heidegger's idea of being in the world, we're always already in the world, which is a social world loaded with meanings. And of course, Merleau-Ponty develops this idea a lot. So I think he would both say that it's good to practice simple acts of perception and be curious about those. But I don't think he would say that just perceiving with no thoughts or anything else is the natural thing to do, or perhaps even, the main thing to do. So that's where it maybe just perceive, the injunction that I gave there kind of maybe brings in some of my Buddhist and mindfulness practices, as well as Merleau-Ponty. Again, curious what others think about that as well.
Nice. We have about 20 minutes left. So we'll do Nina Marie, and then Gunter, and then Tom.
Hi, okay, thank you so much, Dan, for the talk. I'm really enjoying it. So I want to ask about, with these conversations about praxis and about offering these different ways of dealing with the attention economy and this meditation, often these things that are offered, they can be very helpful, and they are obviously, if we can get to doing them, they will work. But the praxis is offered as a solution to the thing that is a barrier for us to be able to do the praxis. So with what you mentioned about tech desiccating the interworld, and you saying that it can go both ways, do you think it's possible for tech to be changed, for the algorithms, especially looking at social media, for the algorithms to be changed in such a way that it doesn't offer that barrier anymore? Is that barrier a product of the technology itself, or is it more a product of the economy and the knowledge economy, the instrumental knowledge economy under which it is developed?
Yeah, really good question. And just to start with the thing about the practices being kind of a solution to the problem, but the problem itself is why it's hard to do them. And that is definitely true. And the only kind of caveat maybe to add to that is, if the experiences we have with, say, contemplative practice through yoga or through just like art or like through meditation or whatever it is, if that touches us in a deep way or transforms maybe our worldview in some way, that then has the potential to change maybe our relationship with tech at a deeper level. I don't mean naively that we can then just get rid of the stuff and live like a kind of Zen kind of life, but we may, the practices are more than just a kind of sticking plaster or kind of a short-term fix for a problem that is not going away, if they involve like a change in worldview and how we actually see who we are as humans, or how we, maybe have profound experiences with other people that changes the course of our life. Yes, it doesn't change the existence of the digital attention economy, but it may change us in ways which are kind of maybe a little bit deeper than simply managing coping strategies. But absolutely right that these dynamics and these kind of incentive structures seem to me pretty baked in. So the kind of media ecosystem in the capitalist framework as it stands seems so embedded that I don't know how strongly to put it. I mean, on the one hand, there are very different ways of developing these tech products, and certainly the very different ways of encouraging us for the conversations we're having in our own development of our habits. Different habits will have a very different reality. And a lot of people may use tech in the most dynamic and fluid and relational ways, and really not use tech in the ways where they find it's very one-sided, very passive, So I guess I'd be cautious about saying that, because basically my main thing would be the kind of political economy of the whole system is the biggest issue, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. And so you see, for instance, there's an app called Be Real. It's like you get new apps. One's called Be Real, and it's about how to be more authentic in your sharing with other people. And if you look at how it's designed, it does look more authentic. It's encouraging more authentic behavior than Instagram is. I think it really is. And probably the intentions of the founders are good ones. But basically, it is ultimately an app about taking selfies and sharing them with your network every day. And ultimately, when that's what the activity is about, and of course, depending on the funding model, the business model of the app itself, you're inevitably going to get this instrumentalizing impulse. So not sure how this will evolve, but a lot of sympathy for the basic problem that you've identified. What do you think?
Oh, I want to have hope. I mean, I of course think with social media, the way that it's connecting us to knowledge, that was a big part of my my honors thesis, was looking at like how it's connecting us to knowledge and how that is really important to helping us, could help us escape the echo chambers that we had before social media, but now I have the new echo chambers. So I really want to believe as much as I can that there is a possibility of changing the algorithms to make it better. And I do believe that it could happen, but of course, it actually happening is a bit unrealistic.
It's just on the algorithms. I went to a conference on digital well-being in 2019 when that was still a relatively new kind of concatenation of terms. And someone in the audience made this comment about rather than algorithms based around relevance, i.e. relevant content, what, Nina Marie will want to click on, algorithms based on resonance, so resonance rather than relevance. And the idea is, how can we build algorithms which are kind of encouraging this two-way thing, and kind of a bit more humility actually as well, as to like, look, I as the platform don't know what you want to look at necessarily, but can I foster kind of interactions between people, or sharing in ways which is kind of generative, but I don't know what, of course, then, okay, what does that actually look like as an algorithm? How would that work? And I don't know the details. It's just a comment that was made I thought was kind of interesting to follow up on.
Thank you.
Okay, Gunter.
Hi, Dan, great talk. I love your title as well, Just Perceive. When I raised my hand, I had one question. now I have so many. I'll try to structure my mind a bit. First, going back a bit to the algorithms. So I think there are two parts. One is the economical part, the business part, but also the technical part of bringing ethics into the algorithms. And I think I see there more possibilities or easier steps. It's also very complicated, but very interesting, but easier steps to make changes than in the changing the economy. But that's not my question. It's just ideas. I said I like your title, and so Just Perceive. And for me, I'm not a native English speaker, but I saw a few other titles with just, and I expected the kind of pun there, also related to justice. So there is, for me in English, there's just perceive is like just do it, but also perceive in a just way. So creating justice while perceiving. And for me, it relates to the Buddhist views of right view and right perception and right talking, etc., etc. So that's my first question: is it present for you there? The other question is very strongly related, but I think it for me it relates to what Cora was asking, and it's my struggle with phenomenology, besides pronouncing the name. And that is, so when I read it, and also when I heard your presentation, I often feel that you have a right way of looking and a wrong way of looking, and looking with technology is the wrong way, and looking without technology is the right way. But of course, as a philosopher of technology, you have these post-phenomenologists saying, okay, you have the world is all, or looking at the world is always mediated. So I like the picture with your colleagues around the table there, all behind their laptop. Even without the Google glasses, the laptops are there, and that's very different from when you are with the same colleagues in a pub or walking in the woods. So in that sense, the correct, I will use the word correct, the correct way of looking doesn't exist. It's being this openness, and in a wood, there is maybe other stimuli for openness than in an office. But maybe in the office there are like it's maybe warm, and maybe in the wood it's too cold, and you so that also has its downsides. So it's what I sometimes perceive in phenomenology is the Disney World division of the world, is the good ones and the bad ones. So that would be my my related question with the just and the justice.
Yeah, great question, and nicely linked. It's very interesting. So I hadn't thought of just perceive. I hadn't thought of it once, and I've been using this kind of phraseology for quite a while in terms of justice. I mean, another thing, but I completely see that it could be. And the meaning of just in my mind was kind of the opposite of being loaded normatively. It's like just simply only perceive, and of course perceive, and so then this links to your second, and well, just I'll say as well, in English we say just looking. Oh, when you go into the shop and they say, oh, would you like some help with the suits we've got? And you say, oh, I'm just looking. So it's like, oh, I'm looking, but not more than that. And that's meant to be quite, I'm not committing to more than that act of seeing, which I think culturally we see to look, to perceive, to hear as less ethically or morally charged or loaded than, you know, action of doing whatever that doing may or may not be. If you think about, you know, debates about ethics, they're typically going to be about action more than perceiving. Perceiving may have a role, but probably auxiliary to the act and whether that act is judged to be moral or not, and so on. So, and with that then, so I hadn't thought of just perceive with justice, but with looking in the right way or the wrong way, I mean, it's an interesting issue, because I think the idea of perceiving, I think ideally is not loaded with right or wrong ways, but it's something, it's meant to link, I think, inherently to openness and receptivity to what's there, being open to what we can see or perceive around us, as opposed to imposing our views or imposing our judgments onto the world. We're just kind of perceiving things. So having said that, like you said, are there right and wrong ways? I mean, again, I think a lot of artists, and I also think phenomenologists, may say there's not necessarily right or wrong ways of perceiving, but it's more that it's okay to recognize that seeing itself is something we can learn to get better at. It's something we can treat. Again, it comes back to respect, that we may assume, okay, yeah, seeing we can, as if we're well-sighted physiologically, then we know how to see. So let's focus on learning, gaining information or knowledge or skills about other things. And Dorothea Lange, and I think many artists would say, well, no, there's a practice of seeing. And I think also contemplative traditions, perceiving the breath in the body. As a mindfulness practitioner, I can do kind of with no practice, but the more I deepen my practice, the more I notice with the actual sensations themselves. So the point is simply that, perceiving is something when I say it's perceiving is something we can cultivate our ability for, it doesn't mean that we then see things in the right way and before we saw the wrong things, but it's just acknowledging that that is a capability or capacity that we can create. And then the question is the way that we're looking at things, like scrolling really quickly, the question is, you could just leave it as a question, how is that for our ability to see closely, to see attentively? And I think probably, my bias is, or my hunch is that that's probably not as good as going for a walk in the woods with your colleagues, to give your example, and just being with what you notice in your environment. If you could do that every day, compared to, be on your phone for the same amount of time every day, I don't know, one seems like you may gain more than the other. What do you think?
Yeah, it relates with some publicity now. We with the group organizing this, we wrote an article and we recently published it, and the title is relating to that. So it's attention as practice. So it's exactly what you are saying, that the practice is important, but what I find very intriguing, I notice that you're struggling with it, but I don't have an answer at all. There is there is a lot of normativity in that as well. So I think it needs a lot of more debunking of what the normativity is there, and as researchers, we can say, yeah, that's great, because it gives us more stuff to think about. As a designer of cell phones, then it's of course say, okay, you react against us, but what is your alternative? And so it comes back to Nina Marie's question of okay, suppose we say we no business model anymore, and I see my colleague Uzay Kaimak is AI scholar, says, okay, give me information and I will put it in the code. What will we say to the people in the economy and people in the AI field? And that I think I don't have an answer yet.
Mm.
Yeah.
Can I just say as well, thank you. I completely agree with your point about kind of obvious versus less obvious forms of normativity. And so, for example, if I say, you know, just perceiving the world is kind of normatively neutral because you're simply perceiving, whereas when you judge when you make decisions or something, well, yeah, maybe there's normative things come into that, but not at the basic level of perception. And that itself, of course, is a big claim and needs interrogating, and I don't think it stands up, like as you're alluding to. So although I still believe that coming back to moment perceptual experience is extremely helpful and beneficial, it's not to say that injunction itself is somehow ethically neutral or doesn't, or what it is to perceive something, again, has no normative baggage embedded into it, and you have to look at that. So I just think that's really important. I mean, I felt it as well with Suraj's discussion last time around, I think, bare attention and kinds of attending, and it was perfectly reasonable what he was saying, but I was thinking what he's proposing in terms of how we attend. So in certain Buddhist traditions will present something as, oh, this is ethically neutral to perceive, for instance, come back to the example I've given, to pay attention to the breath in the body. We can explore, okay, that's great, but what's going on with choosing to pay attention to the breath in the body rather than choosing to attend to something else? So it's not ethically neutral when we have practices, as you said, which involve us attending to or perceiving quite particular things. And the question is, okay, why those things? I mean, a friend put it to me that, you know, with this just perceiving, there's a kind of primacy to what's immediate around us, which is a fair thing. You know, like if I'm just perceiving what's around my immediate environment all the time, okay, what does that say about my understanding of world events and things I should know about and be engaged on outside of my immediate environment, for instance? So just to say, hold it lightly, at that aspect of the kind of normativity that is or isn't baked in. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm in the position now of the moderator, and I have to be very strict because we have about sort of 7 minutes left before I close up and just say, you know, tell you about the next speakers. So what we're going to do is we're going to do the 3 questions all at once, and then Dan can sort of pick what's resonating. So we'll do Tom, Andreas, and Uze. Thanks. We can't hear you, Tom.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dan, for a great talk. My question started as something very easy, and in the course of the discussion, it became complicated. Maybe I'll try to save some time and just react to something, especially to something that Kåre mentioned, the tension between just perceiving and seeing with the whole culture. As a meditation practitioner, I realize that when you say just perceiving, it starts with just perceiving the breath or the backbone or you know, or contact of your thumbs and stuff like that. But as you continue just perceiving, you can also just perceive your beliefs. And that's not always a pleasant surprise. I mean, oh my God, do I believe this about me? Or is this what I expect from meditation? Or is this what I expect from life and stuff like that? So there, the whole culture and just perceiving, they can meet. And now linking up to that, which turns out to be a question maybe, is that don't we also perceive a tweet with all that we are and with the whole of our culture? So that was my question.
Oh, great. Okay, great question. I'm going to go right to Andreas.
Yeah, I try to be brief as well. Great talk, great discussion. I have two observations more than the one was with regard to the two modes of just perceiving on the one side, which where art is a great example, and the other one is like the industrialized technology that wants to maximize utility. And on the one side, of course, you have the same distinction in Heidegger's famous essay on the question concerning technology, where precisely the way an artist sees a river is very different from an engineer who wants to build a power plant. And Heidegger has this very mysterious, well, there are many things mysterious in Heidegger, but he has this mysterious part that he doesn't elaborate the distinction between modern technology and pre-modern technology, where his idea is, well, the idea of imposing our utility, our instrumentalization on the world at this scale is a feature of modern technology, but is not a necessary feature of technology itself. There is probably still an open question for phenomenologists to try to figure out what then the pre-modern technology is with regard to, what are the features of the non-modern technologies? That's also a bit of Nina Marie's question. But it seems to me that maybe the right way of thinking about this is to put those two ways of engaging with the world, the imposition of my ends on the world in modern industrialized technology on the one side, and the withdrawal of just perceiving as two extremes, where the interaction in the world that I have needs to have both, right? I need to balance out my goals and interests with the interaction of the world. So probably you should see them at the end of a spectrum rather than as one being the solution to the other. So maybe you need a mixture of the two. What this mixture is, that's a tricky thing to tease out. But that would be maybe my hint here, that there might be some sweet spot where they both meet. And then my second comment is, the reason why I also tend to think this is that even though I have great respect for the phenomenological transition, if you look at how human perception works, we actually don't perceive the world as just perceiving. We perceive it as the world in which we act and where things have affordances to us. So we perceive the world always under the header of a practice. So there might be something in this idea of in the two extremes. It's more a comment on the discussion. Some things I find fascinating than a question to you, but I feel there might be something in a third category missing between those two extremes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, and Use.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief as well. So first of all, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk and also the discussion. As Günther said, I am an AI researcher. I don't know much about philosophy, but as AI researcher, I typically subscribe indeed to the idea of information processing and data processing for perceiving and so on. And then what I wonder is it possible actually to just perceive, in the sense that don't we always have some kind of either a goal or some kind of mental model in our heads actually that drives our perceiving? So, you have these famous picture of a Dalmatian in psychology, for instance, where you just see a bunch of black blobs. But if you have never seen a Dalmatian, if you don't know that conception, I'm pretty sure you will not perceive that at all. Yeah. So is it possible then to talk about just perceiving? Or are we talking about that the agent actually should be flexible enough that each time you look at the whatever you're studying at the object, you should be able to look at it in different ways and maybe perceive it from different perspectives, and therefore you need to be flexible as the agent actually to be able to just perceive, to see all these things in its totality. So that is my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I come back on that short of time?
Yeah, so I would suggest we all just release the expectation that we're going to answer those questions, and we can think about them throughout the day and let them brew. So maybe if you just want to have a closing minute, maybe responding to the questions, but maybe if you want to do it another way, that's fine. But just about a minute. Yeah.
Comments and
I think are people having trouble hearing Dan? Yes. Okay. Like you're fuzzy. We can hear you, but
that's difficult. Hold on. Setting.
You just perceive noise, but it's probably not there.
Oh, that's right. I could.
If you just come close, it seems to be better.
How about I've changed mic now? How's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. So I've used 30 seconds. No, great comments. I mean, I guess on the just think about Heidegger and kind of that technology has become, or our use of technology has become more instrumentalizing compared to, like kind of pre-modern. And I just think about, with tech and the instrumentalization of seeing, and I think about, as well as smart glasses, they're developing like, smart contact lenses. I mean, this is a long way off, but the idea of a smart contact lens where, I could be the concierge in a hotel, and then just through my lens is like, oh, Mr. Smith, great to see you. Like it can tell me who it is. And I know that's very sci-fi, but it is also being developed, and this is very much where things are going. And the reason I give that example is, if it's true that rather than think of like there was pre-modern and then like modern, if there's been a trend towards instrumentalization of technology and therefore of how we live, I feel like Merleau-Ponty and myself would say, is there something about a moment of eye contact with another person that feels like the single most basic thing of all of our possible experiences as a human being? Question. And of course, you could say biologically, well, just breathing is more basic, et cetera, but to be born into this social world and have eye contact with someone, and then to have, your eye contact through lenses intermediated with data and kind of AI and stuff, that just example feels like kind of the peak. And that's why I think it's interesting maybe to think about that kind of example. And very quickly on Tom's point, I think it was about Twitter. We do, I think, look at Twitter with all that we are and all of our culture is. In terms of all that we are, would just say, for one thing, among other things, when we spend time on Twitter, it can be quite a disembodied experience. I think we're very much in the world of ideas and of opinions, strong opinions. And of course, that's playing out in our body in certain ways, but it both is the case that it's with all that we are and all of our culture is, but also in very particular ways that it, triggers certain ways of engaging, which are quite different from other ways of engaging, as we all know. But yeah, thank you. Good comments.
Okay, yes, thank you so much for the talk today. I would suggest maybe, we remember these little bits of practices that Dan suggested. We can go out and about our day and maybe take, even just the 5 breaths, that doesn't take too long. So we could maybe try and explore this just perceiving, which we all seem to be interested in. I'm putting in the chat the next talks. The next one will be on April 17th. And I guess you all know how to register because you're here. And so you can join me in thanking Dan, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.